Hi there everybody, welcome. In this video I'll talk about FORRT, an education initiative aiming to raise awareness of the educational and pedagogical implications of open science and reproducible science movements in higher education. So FORRT stands for Framework of Open and Reproducible Research Training. And in this presentation, I'll try to identify what we collectively see as a blind spot in both the open and reproducible science movements and contextualize it in the larger ethos of higher education. We will advance the idea that sustainability or dissustainability of open and reproducible science movement also lies on how we teach our students about what science is and the processes that it entails, the processes of science. We'll then propose a solution to the problem we identify, but we argue that understanding what really is at stake boils down to your own answer to a fundamental question relating to the role of higher education. In light of our answer, our interpretation, or how we see it, we'll propose FORRT and explain how we see the best educational practices in light of open and reproducible science movements. We term these practices as principal teaching and principal mentoring. We then continue by stating FORRT's goals and mission and our three-pronged approach toward achieving these better educational practices. And we'll explain the several ways in which you can adopt these. We'll then talk about what FORRT produced, that is to say our manuscript, our e-learning platform, and a few successful implementations of teaching and mentoring of open and reproducible science themes. We now have a dedicated team working towards creating new and cataloging existing successful pedagogies so that the community can not only learn new and interesting ways to teach their students, but also focus their efforts on adapting materials rather than creating them. We'll then briefly discuss FORRT Educational Nexus, and we'll talk about how we understand the literature of open and reproducible science and present to you a pedagogical classification, a taxonomy, if you will, that aims at streamlining the teaching of these practices to your students. So it's not directed at academics or understanding the open science or scholarship literature. We'll then talk about our self-assessment educational tool, which allows you to test the extent to which your teaching and mentoring abides by open and reproducible science tenets. This survey is only for you, and we will use this anonymous unidentified data for advocacy purposes. And lastly, we'll talk about resources that we collected and that we are curating now so that the community has at its disposal a platform that is easy access to a variety of educational resources as well for several fields that hopefully decreases the time and effort spending in searching for these, but also in terms of adapting to a new and specific context and culture. We'll then finish by inviting you to contribute to our mission and our initiative, and we hope that this will be useful to you. All right, so now we're going to talk about what we see as the problem. So recently, in light of reproducibility crisis, the scientific community took steps to reflect a widespread awareness and call for improved research practices, which led to what we now know as credibility revolution. This include higher standards of what constitutes scientific evidence, pre-registration of studies, registered reports, direct replications, transparency and openness relating to research materials, better access to scientific article, and research integrity altogether. So for this reform, since 2012, three pillars were proposed to carry out social sciences towards the so-called academic utopia. These are the opening of scientific communication, second, restructuring incentives and practices, and third, collaborative and crowdsourcing. However, ongoing attempts have neglected an essential aspect of academic machinery: students, future consumers of science and future producers of science. And indeed, we argue current norms for the teaching and mentoring um, in higher education are rooted in obsolete practices, which itself requires reform. So, in our view, and in our community's view, the scientific utopia would require a fourth pillar. This extra supporting pod would help maintain its sustainability and entails familiarizing higher education students with the intricacies of research making or science making. In other words, we should communicate the facts of science relative to the processes by which it was acquired. In this sense, our community believes that the teaching and mentoring of open and reproducible research practices is the clearest indicator of the degree to which institutions and departments embody credible science. Indeed, FORRT is designed by and envisioned for educators who wish to integrate typical discipline content with open and reproducible science tenets. And this goes beyond paying lip service to best practices and ideally ensures that students are actually trained to engage and apply these practices in their studies. So now let's focus our attention to the role of higher education. All right, so here's the fundamental question. If science is a process of knowledge production, then is science education best expressed as teaching students the process of science, or is best expressed as teaching them knowledge itself? So, if we focus on teaching students the fact of science, we might not actually be teaching them science, but rather its products. And we might be misleading them about what actually science is. So, as higher education aims to prepare students for an increasingly technological workforce, which changes very fast every day, um, whose, whose advances also increasingly affect everyone's lives, its training in higher education needs or ought to provide knowledge for practical education of scientific output. So the concern expressed here is that higher education or in higher education, it's not sufficient or should not be sufficient to teach about what scientists know, the facts of science. And it might be deceiving to do so. So, should higher education institutions and research teachers within it want to fulfill its institutional prescribed goals, in our opinion, in our community's opinion, it would be necessary to incentivize the integration between teaching of subject matters, your regular prototypical subjects, and the tenets of modern science. So this is what we believe in FORRT. So this is similar to how scientific claims should be taken in light of epistemic uncertainty. That is, the intrinsic incertitude about the validity of truth claims. Or similar to Merton's path dependency, in which scientific progress can only occur through what he termed as organized skepticism. So it's a continuous and iterative debate on the role of random and systematic errors, competing explanations, or interpretations. So these ideas are definitely not new, but they are resurfaced by and enshrined at the core of open and reproducible science movements. So based on this, we should avoid teaching students a false sense of certainty about the facts of science. So our community believes that it's of utmost importance to communicate the facts of science relative to the process by which it was acquired. Basically teaching students the process of science, right? So learning about how scientists know what they learn, right? So together with ethical and social justice concerns, which by the way you can learn more about in our manuscript, We believe, our community believes, that principal teaching and mentoring, or principal education, if you will, is a desirable future for our higher education, and we should aspire to it. And indeed, we think there are many great advantages of empowering students with principal educational practices. For example, it breeds an atmosphere of constructive curiosity and problem solving. It endows students with the ability to discover their own their own, and students' work also sometimes, or ideally, serve a meaningful practical purpose to partake, for example, in the scientific community or positively affect it in case there is some sort of discovery or contribution. But most importantly, it helps shatter the academic glass ceiling and promote engagement with the academic profession. This alone, we think, is one of the main reasons why we should strive for its principal education. So we created FORRT to advocate for more principal education in higher education, to raise awareness of the educational implications of open and reproducible science, as well as to develop ways to deal with the associated challenges of this. For example, curricular reform, epistemological uncertainty, methods or better methods of education, social justice, principal education, and the opening of teaching materials. So considering that in the US, master's degrees are now as common as bachelor degrees were in the 60s, and in Europe in the same period, they have increased fivefold their population of tertiary degrees. This idea that is prevalent in higher education nowadays, that science education is only desirable for future academics, is unbecoming. And not to mention that perhaps it would help mitigate widespread belief in conspiracy theories, but that's more of a personal note from yours truly than a comment of the community. So we introduced FORRT, and here it's a long slide, so we'll talk about there's information on what else we do, why we do the things we do, so what do we want, what we advocate for. So basically, we want to recognize and support principal teaching and mentoring. We want to provide pathways towards incremental integration of discipline content with open and reproducible science tenets. We want to empower higher education students and the general public who goes through higher education with the understanding to educate and produce knowledge themselves. We want to foster social justice through the opening and democratization of scientific educational resources. We are collating existing teaching and mentoring materials and pedagogies to be used and repurposed by the community and adapted to its cultural context. And we are also trying to promote changes in academic incentive structure by building a community with existing educational initiatives and strengthening our missions, identifying and reduce redundancies, and streamlining advancement of open and reproducible educational practices. So we are ambitious, and so FORRT hopes to achieve these goals by using a three-pronged approach. Our first prong is FORRT clusters. We hope to provide educators a comprehensive, straightforward, and accessible framework to understand the literature of open and reproducible science through an educational pedagogical lens. That is, FORRT provides a pedagogically informed taxonomy of open and reproducible research practices and literature, which is readily to be applied by educators and instructors on their teaching and mentoring. Also, we developed a self-assessment tool based on this, what we call FORRT clusters, which educators can now be supplied with a personalized pathway towards incremental integration of discipline content with open and reproducible science tenets. Basically, what this means is that it's a dynamic survey that you can use to assess your teaching in light of open and reproducible research tenets that gives you feedback moving forward. In what way does it do that? So if you wish, as you go through the survey, there is an option. Um, the survey is anonymous. That you receive feedback, so it's completely optional. We won't bother you with additional literature if you don't want to. Our second prong aims to equipping scholars with high quality, easily findable, and metadata enrichable um, resources that our community is currently curating and enriching um, on open and reproducible research practices. So this is what we call FORRT Educational Nexus, where you can find teaching resources on a variety of topics and fields. And another part of this prong is FORRT's pedagogies, in which instructors, as explained, pedagogies are successful strategies or teaching strategies that aim to better convey open and reproducible research tenets to help transition you or educators and reduce their burden and towards this incremental path. So our third research, prong, I didn't change the slides. That's great. That's really great, Flavio. I'm sorry. So now that you see the slide, our third prong aims at modifying the academic incentive structure regarding teaching and mentoring through the recognition and commendation of excellent teaching and mentoring, which in turn are documentable, relevant to research's visibility, prestige, and to near promotion reviews. So basically this means that FORRT aims to highlight excellent instances of teaching and mentoring. And it's also why FORRT is an open and collaborative project, so that scholars that are concerned with better teaching and mentoring can also be recognized in the academic currency, which is scientific papers. So here are easy ways to adopt principal education. As we move forward with our project, which is still in development, we do have a website and we do have several things as we are presenting here. We are constantly building our community so it can better help instructors. So these are just 4 ways in which we think are noteworthy for adopting principal education. So the first is to make your existing teaching and mentoring materials open. And this is because open educational resources, research resources, are beneficial regardless of the subject or language and allow the community contributions for iterative improvement of materials. So for example, making your teaching and mentoring materials open allows the community to do things like enhance documentation, add media like transcripts, voice, video, translate materials, and altogether this improves accessibility. So educators can use and readapt materials to their own context and needs, which reduces time encumberment for producing high quality materials, as well as democratization of good resources materials. So altogether, it effectively allows for meaningful participation of civil society in the process of learning, research, and innovation. The second is make your research open, and increasingly well-documented research repositories are used as educational resources in undergraduate and graduate education. For example, we have initiatives like collaborative replications and education project in psychology, also known as GRAPE. And we also have the Political Science Replication Initiative, PSRI, led by Nicole Jans, and the GRAPE is led by Jordan Wage. And these projects use research materials and they, among other things, they try to replicate research. FORRT Pedagogies also has around the same ideas. And I want to highlight a roadmap for graduate students, which is a recent paper by, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Tavala, Silverstein, Siet, to which propose easing into open science, a tutorial for graduate students, and It's an amazing paper, and it aims to assist graduate students to engage in open science practices. So they actually give graduate students ideas, more than ideas, on how to approach conversations with their collaborator and advisors, idea on how to integrate open science practice within their graduate school framework, and they also give specific resources on how to engage with each material. So it's really great. So to summarize, we made this line to talk about the FORRT products. That is what we produced since late 2018 when we first had the idea of FORRT. So FORRT's team wrote a manuscript explaining why open and reproducible tenets should be incorporated in the teaching and mentoring of prototypical subject matter. And the manuscript, I don't want to sound braggadocious at all, but the manuscript is a really nice manuscript. It's community driven. It has gone through several rounds of revision, and it's an altogether nice manuscript. So I would say that it's an interesting piece to read. With that said, and in lines of principles enshrining FORRT, this manuscript is still an online contributorship project, and all the work that is put into it is valued, and it is formally recognized. With this, we hope to expand the scope and diversity of FORRT's mission as well as its team. So as mentioned before, FORRT creates, collects, and catalogs examples of successful pedagogical approaches in teaching, mentoring, in teaching and mentoring of open and reproducible research tenets, and as well as we advocate for the openness of these resources. So interested parties, say scholars, instructors, educational institutions, can use FORRT pedagogies as a template towards the creation of their own teaching strategies, and hopefully that facilitates the whole process. FORRT pedagogies also strive to support teachers and mentors to integrate field-specific education with open and reproducible research tenets. So we're trying to find ways in which FORRT can help do that in several fields. It's our hope. We are working towards it, but we're starting. Mm-hmm. So the educational nexus, the third part of FORRT project, which is on the website, of course, is educational nexus, and it's a platform to find, access, interoperate, and reuse, so that's the FAIR acronym, resources and teaching materials. The pedagogical content of all resources will be maximized to facilitate adaptation and reuse. So we are working on enriching the data from that database all the time. We have a specialized team on it. We welcome new contributions. So if you have new resources or older, if you want to enrich the database to help diversity and collate resources, it's widely welcome. FORRT strongly advocates for these resources to be used, cited, and recognized as to be expected. So I do want to zoom in into FORRT clusters a little bit because we have a lot there and it might be useful. So the first thing is what are FORRT's educational clusters? How did we go about our educational pedagogically informed taxonomy? So basically you have that on your right on the slides, and it relates to reproducibility and replicability knowledge and history of these concepts. The second cluster has to do with conceptual and statistical knowledge. The third with reproducible analysis, or everything that involves that. The fourth, pre-registration. The fifth, FAIR data and materials. The sixth, replication research. And the seventh, it has to do with academic life and culture, which is also important for students to learn and know about how it works. Otherwise, how else would they imagine themselves as being part of it, right? So the second part is the FORRT assessment tool. There's a video on this by Sam Parsons, but basically We hope that this tool is used by teachers to benchmark their current teaching and mentoring. Um, and respondents are given the opportunity to do that, to evaluate both their mentoring, their teaching, or just one of them. During the survey, respondents are invited to reflect on the extent to which um, students are exposed to these contents, right? For example, the extent to which is whether something is not yet enacted, so opportunities just for some, or course requirements, so that it has a sort of a quality to it. And the other quality has to do with the level to which students are required to engage with it. So not yet enacted means there isn't any, whether they are given just knowledge, whether they are required to practice, or whether they are required to apply, right? So um, in this way, we hope to acquire data for advocacy purposes, but also it's interesting that these two sort of bidimensional ways of evaluation of teaching and mentoring give us a fine granularity when it comes to assessing open and reproducible teaching practices, right? So there's no prerequisites for taking the survey. That's important. And the survey was designed as much as possible to be self-explanatory. So as you will see in Sam Parsons' video, whenever we thought it was necessary or whenever we thought it would help, we included extra explanation. So whenever you hover your mouse, it will give you, for example, a definition of p-hacking, for example, or some knowledge that you may not have. Um, so Sam Parsons, by the way, did a really cool video, and I would check it out. It's really nice, and he narrates all the literature that is entailed, and he receives feedback. It's really interesting. When it comes to resources, there's two types of resources that is available for it. So first is the FORRT's entry-level selection of open reproducible science literature, and that aims to convey the basic tenets as succinctly as possible. So what we try to do is come up with a selection that is deeply idiosyncratic. Sure, it is community driven, but our community is not we all like teaching, so we're not saying there isn't bias, but what we were hoping for is to have a selection of entry level literature for one to start. In addition, there's a crowdsourced metadata enriched data set of resources, and that's open to the community's input. So meaning people can enrich the data, and people can also find broken links, etc. But they can also associate each resource with one another, or relating it to one of FORRT clusters, etc. So uh, so what this means is that scholars add educational resources via a form. So there's a link on the website, and that feeds the live data set, which increases its impact and visibility. So should you, let's say that you are a producer of a blog or a resource that you think should be out there for people, or that you want to be useful, by all means do go there and put your resource, or if you know other resources that we might not have, put it there. It would be great, actually. We are actually asking for these sort of things because we do have a team that is doing this constantly, but it's a limited amount of people. So we want to say that the form is straightforward and can be easily filled with tags, so that and the resources are appropriately categorized for easier retrieval. And FORRT then FORRT's team, or the database team, verifies all resources and whenever possible add relevant tags and descriptions. So this is what we have for FORRT products. So the next to last slide is about how you can help or how you can contribute. And you can spread the word by talking about better education, share on Twitter, Facebook, your professional listservs, and other social media. You can join our team. It's an open contributorship, open collaborative project. So everything we develop and produce is in the open. Even our communications are in the open on Slack. So you can join by going through the onboarding process. There is a link there. You go on the website, how can you join? And there is a specific, so you learn about the organization. But there is something for everyone. And we have an onboarding specific for people whose expertise on GitHub is high and are willing to work on the development of our website as well. And you can always email us, right? So you can become a partner, so say you're an institution, and we have different partner levels, core, strategic, and institutional, that help us develop our principles and everything that relates to how we align and partner up. So if you think that your organization should be would be interested in thinking about a partnership, do let us know. Moreover, we recently released a preprint, a manuscript, introducing FORRT, and you can read it in our website or Open Science Framework. We link that too. And if you just want to discuss ideas, thoughts, we have opened a Slack channel for everyone, so that's where our communication is open to everybody. And it's a platform with ongoing discussions, and you can freely join and let us know your thoughts. That's it. FORRT needs you. I hope you find that slide a little bit funny. You can find us at FORRT.org. The two other links below is our preprint, and the other is our OSF folder. I hope this has been useful. It was a pleasure to talk to you about FORRT. To be able to express this is a pleasure. It's a project that it's a community project, so I'm just the presenter here. A lot of people are involved on things like development of the website or editing the manuscript. There's a live manuscript, by the way, online, so you can provide help. The other day we found out that we had a very important reference that was missing. So by all means, you yourself can collaborate. And we hope to see you on our Slack channel or receiving an email from you. Thank you very much for spending all this time listening to me. Apologies for my English. And thank you so much.